Well, we're looking at what happened in the early church. We've seen how the church got started, that it, of course, is founded upon Jesus Christ, his life and death and resurrection. And then we saw how the church expanded from its beginning in Jerusalem, following the book of Acts, from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the earth, to the ends of the earth, and talking about the Roman world, going throughout the Roman world. We've looked at some of that, especially as it was accomplished through the Apostle Paul. But now we get to the end of the time period of 40 years following the death of Jesus. There's a time frame of 40 there, just like in the rest of the Bible. I hope you're familiar with how the word or the number 40 occurs a number of times to indicate testing or tribulation or trial. And in this case, or just transition of one kind or another. I'm not going to take time to go through all those, but there's a period of 40 years where there's this transition from the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the old way of doing things with the sacrificial system, and then going into the time where Jesus has fulfilled all of that, and now it's faith in Christ. There's no more offering sacrifices. God doesn't want the sacrificial system to continue for people to be involved in that. He wants them to simply have faith in his Son, Jesus Christ. And so there's this time period of 40 years where the gospel has gone forth, it's gone out there, and we're going to see that now at the end of this 40-year period, God's going to put a definite end to the Old Covenant, the Old Testament way of doing things. And we're going to see how that happens today. We're going to begin with considering who the Zealots were. Remember the Zealots? They were one of several different religious parties that we looked at quite some time ago. Remember, we looked at Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Herodians and also the Zealots. Remember that the Zealots were an offshoot of the Pharisees, the Hasidim, the Pharisees. The Zealots were a little more strong in the way they approached things. They were a little more extreme, you might say, in the way they approached things. The Pharisees wanted the Romans to get out of the Holy Land, but the Zealots actually did something about it. And they engaged in assassinations, they engaged in guerrilla warfare, doing what they could to rid the land of what was making it impure, that is, the presence of the Romans. Not only worked against the Romans, but also against any Jewish people that cooperated with the Romans. So you remember, what's one of their prime targets as they're looking at Jewish people that collaborate?
Sadducees?
No, not Sadducees. Well, the Sadducees would be cooperators, and they may have gone after them some, but there's somebody even worse than them. What occupation is a great collaborator with Rome? Works with Rome?
Taxpayers. Taxpayers. No. Tax collectors.
Tax collectors. And what's the name for the tax collectors? Publicans. Is that what you said? Yeah, publicans. So they try to assassinate those kind of people. All right, so we look at this chart, and we can see some of what we've been talking here. Now, we're going to be looking specifically at certain zealots. There's one by the name of Hezekiah, and you see his relationship with Herod. He was executed by Herod, and then he's followed by Judah of Gamla, who attacked the city of Sepphoris, founded the Zealot party with Zadok the Pharisee in AD 6, was probably killed by Herod Antipas. His beliefs were that God alone may rule Israel, pay taxes to no one but God. Remember that question came up with Jesus. Slavery is worse than death. So better to be dead than to be a slave to Rome. We're going to see how that plays out. Then there's the sons of Judah, Jacob, Simeon, and Yair. Jacob was crucified in 48. Simeon was crucified in 48. Don't know what happened to Yair. And then the grandsons of Judah, Eleazar ben Yair and Menahem, were leaders then of this rebellion. Menahem is going to lead the rebellion in Jerusalem against Rome. He would die in 66. Eleazar is the son of Yair here. He's the commander of Masada. that we will come to in a few minutes. All right, so what happens? In AD 66, the Zealots had had enough of Roman rule, and so they took up arms against the Romans in a widespread revolt. Oh, I forgot to give you the prelude. You have a prelude in your notes. Let me go through that first. Sorry about that, I jumped ahead. In AD 45, we had a Jewish prophet who attempted to lead the Jews to rebel. That didn't work out. In 47, a prophet named Judas attempted to revolt against Rome. In 48, another prophet tried to lead a rebellion. Governor Fadus had him killed. Fadus was then deposed and replaced by an evil, corrupt, ruthless governor named Cumanus, who governed Judea from 48 to 52. In AD 48, Cyrus began to move toward violent resistance. In 49, some Jews living in Rome started a riot. It's unclear whether those rioting believed that the Messiah would appear in Rome to set the Jewish people free, or if Jews were protesting against the preaching of Jesus Christ in the synagogue, which you'll see a lot of other places, in the book of Acts especially. At that point, suspicious of any commotion that smacked of insurrection, Emperor Claudius ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Now, I tend to lean toward the idea that this had something to do with Christians that were in Rome, because Claudius, kicking out all the Jews entirely, was specifically acting against Christian Jews, because remember, Christians for the most part this time were Jewish, and so he was called Antichrist by the Christians. This took over a year, during which Jewish hatred of Claudius increased, earning him the title Anti-Messiah or Antichrist. Many Jews emigrated to Greece from Rome, where there was open discussion about declaring war on the empire. And it's in this context that the Apostle Paul met up with two of the exiles, Aquila and Priscilla, in Corinth. Does that sound familiar to you, Aquila and Priscilla? Paul meets them in Corinth. We find in the book of Acts, because they had been kicked out of Rome. It's in Acts 18. Then in the year 50, a Roman soldier stood on the roof of the temple in Jerusalem, making an obscene gesture at the Jews below. This caused a riot, prompting the Roman governor to call out his troops. Some 2,000 Jews were crushed to death. Shortly thereafter, a Roman soldier burned a copy of the Torah. After much anger, petitions, and demands by the Jews, the soldier was beheaded. 2 years later, the Samaritans attacked some Galilean Jews who were on their way to a Jerusalem festival. Apparently, they didn't go around Samaria like many Jews did. They went through and were attacked. The Galilean Jews retaliated by burning several Samaritan villages. This entire matter was brought before a Roman court in Antioch, Syria. The high priest at the same time sent all the way to Rome to ask the emperor to remove the Roman governor Cumanus from Israel. Cumanus' heavy-handedness, corruption, and insensitivity to the Jews could no longer be tolerated. The emperor then banished Cumanus. A man named Felix took his place as the new governor of Israel. In 52, there were constant efforts to revolt against Rome, including an Egyptian Jew who attempted to conquer Jerusalem. And then for the very first time since Rome had conquered Israel in 62 BC, the emperor began sending governors to Israel for short terms because of the growing unrest there. They all proved to be corrupt and inept. All right, I tell you all that just so you get a flavor for what it's like living in Israel at this time. Constant turmoil, constant rebellions, and this is a plague on the Romans because they don't want to have to handle all this stuff all the time, and they've got to try to maintain control, and also on the Jewish people that are there because there's this constant turmoil. And I'm reminded of what Jesus said to his disciples of one of the signs before he would return was that there would be wars and rumors of wars. Up until this time, the peace of Rome ruled throughout the Mediterranean world. Pax Romana, remember? But now, as we're getting further and further along from the time when Jesus died in 33 AD up into the 50s and 60s, we find that there are many insurrections. There are many wars going on in the area around Israel, and you can imagine many rumors of wars, of insurrections to come, of people that are starting problems. All right, so that brings us up then to what occurs in the Jewish war when enough was enough. By May 66, during the term of Gessius Florus ruling over Israel, the Jews decided they had had enough. In response to a pagan sacrifice of a bird that was set deliberately in front of a synagogue in Caesarea as a mock sacrifice to ridicule Jews as unclean lepers, a delegation of Jews protested to Florus. They complained that he was not protecting them, even though they had given him a special gift to do so. Florus exploded at this public rebuke, fining them 17 gold talents for removing treasures from a Roman city. When he rode to Jerusalem to collect the money from the temple treasury, some zealots mocked him by going around with baskets begging for the poor, destitute Roman procurator. Oh, give to the poor Roman procurator. He has no money. He has to take it from us. Florus was so enraged that he then ordered Roman troops to raid the markets in Jerusalem, with the result that some 3,600 Jewish men, women, and children were slaughtered. There were some Roman soldiers, maybe Jewish soldiers serving for Rome, who hesitated in obeying this evil command. And because they did not obey in slaughtering men, women, and children, they were whipped and crucified the following day. So they must not have been Romans serving in the Roman army. They must have been at least some other nationality, because Romans were not allowed to be crucified. Judea's Jews, led in part by the intensely rebellious sect called Zealots, took up arms against the Romans in a widespread revolt. But they were not wholly united in their determination to topple Roman rule. Many of Jerusalem's leaders and the high priests, who had long collaborated with the Romans, counseled peace. They were opposed by the Zealots and the Sicarii. This latter group, with daggers concealed in their garments, assassinated Roman collaborators. When the Roman soldiers marched in their annual parade in Jerusalem, the Jews were ordered to salute them, and they did so. But when a man called for the ousting of Florus, the soldiers attacked. Jewish men hiding on the roofs of their houses rained stones down on the soldiers, and others engaged them in hand-to-hand combat. In the end, Florus and the soldiers fled to the provincial capital at Caesarea. So they fled Jerusalem back to the capital, Caesarea. Remember, on the coast, the city that Herod the Great had built. With the cancellation of the temple sacrifice to the emperor, the Jewish war begins. So they'd always offered a sacrifice every year for the well-being of the emperor, and they didn't do it this time. And that's when the war begins. The Zealots soon marched on Jerusalem around the time of the feast of Sukkot, S-U-K-K-O-T, which is the same as the Feast of Tabernacles, and captured the Roman-built Fort Antonia and the palace of Herod. Fort Antonia was that fort that was built right next to the temple and built higher than the temple, so Herod could look down on the temple and make sure nothing was going on that would threaten him. The high priest Ananias was hunted down and murdered. The nearest Roman army was at Syria at the time, and it would take time to arrive in Israel. However, Jewish zealots in Syria killed the entire legion before it crossed into Israel. They had some early success. Herod Agrippa II sent 2,000 horsemen to assist the leaders and priests who were occupying the upper city. Now they're defending it for Rome. while the lower city and the temple were already controlled by the rebels, the zealots. The insurgents, the rebels, scored a series of surprising victories. They drove the cavalry out of the upper city and set fire to the archives, where all debts were recorded. So it was a place where anyone who owed debts was written down on paper, and it was put there on parchment. It was put there. And they burned that because they were encouraging the poor citizens out of gratitude to join them in the rebellion. Look, we burned all the papers that indicate your debts. You no longer have any debts. Join us. They also captured and set fire to the Antonia fortress. By late summer, the revolutionists had taken over the whole of Jerusalem. However, the insurgents were not united. And this is going to present a major problem for the zealots. The chief agitator, Menahem, who I mentioned before, was accused by another zealot, the leader by the name of Eleazar, of becoming a tyrant just like the Romans. He then led a mob that killed Menahem. At this time, the Roman soldiers who were trapped in the tower of Phaziel asked for mercy of Eleazar, pledging that they would throw down their arms if they would be permitted to leave the city. When the Romans exited, throwing down their swords, Eleazar ordered them to be slaughtered. Now he's acting kind of like the Romans did, isn't he? Cestius Gallus, the Syrian military governor, led the crack 12th Legion, called the Thunderers of Rome, down the coast from Antioch to suppress the rebellion in Jerusalem. Miraculously, the outnumbered, undertrained Jews held off Gallus's 6,000 legionnaires and auxiliaries and forced them to retreat. While marching through the Beth Horon Pass 20 miles north of Jerusalem, the Romans were ambushed by zealots who rained down poisoned and fire arrows for hours upon the trapped Romans, who could only wave their swords fruitlessly against their unreachable attackers hidden in the heights of the valley's cliffs. Losing several thousand men, the famous Roman legion fled by night, leaving their sacred legionary standards and heavy catapults behind. Reassured by their victories, the Jews went so far as to mint their own coins. Now that's a sign that you're ready to control your country, minting coins. Well, what was the Roman response? Well, Nero was Caesar at this time, and when he heard about the defeat of his crack troops, he responded. Well, he was also involved with a lot of turmoil at home of his own. Rome had burned 3.5 years earlier. Remember, many people thought he had had a hand in it. The accusations from local mobs that he had caused it. And then he decided to find a scapegoat, try to blame somebody else. And he decided to blame this new sect of Christians for burning Rome. And he proceeded to murder hundreds of them, probably including both the apostles Paul and Peter. So that's what's happening in Rome. When he heard about the defeat of his crack troops, he dispatched his top commander, General Titus Flavius Vespasian, to quell the rebellion. He was a skilled military strategist, and he was accompanied by 3 legions of infantry, plus cavalry and engineers, and they advanced first on Galilee. Despite the string of fortresses that Josephus, the one who would later write about all this, but he was commander of the Jewish forces at the time in Galilee, and he had built these fortresses, but the region fell to the Romans. Vespasian's troops seized the coast road next and moved inland, retaking territory after territory until by 68 AD the Romans were ready to isolate Jerusalem. So on this map, you see the Galilean campaign. You see Vespasian. Titus is his son, who is fighting along with him, and all these places in Galilee that they took. You might recognize some of the names of the locations. And then he moved from Galilee down into Samaria, passing through Samaria for the most part, and coming into Judea. And in Judea, he went town by town. From Caesarea, came down along the coast, and then also over this way. So his armies conquered town by town throughout Judea until finally they come to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is isolated. Meanwhile, Jerusalem had broken up into factions, including 20,000 Idumeans who gained entrance to the city at the end of AD 67, leading to battles which consumed thousands of Jewish men. So the Jews that were inside, the different zealot groups, were fighting against each other. And then these Idumeans snuck in, 20,000 of them snuck into the city, and now they're fighting against them. And so a lot of Jewish lives were lost, either fighting with one another or fighting against these Edomites before the Romans ever got there. And then Nero committed suicide. June 9th, year 68. And that led to a temporary lull while Vespasian awaited orders. Okay, who's the next emperor? What's going to happen now? And so he didn't do anything. Wasn't sure what the next emperor might want. It was during this lull that many Christians that found themselves in the city escaped, just as Jesus had directed them in Matthew 24, where Jesus told them, when you see these things happening, escape to the mountains. And so the Christians did, because they had the warning of Jesus. 3 emperors came and went before Vespasian himself returned to Rome to become head of the realm and became emperor. He sailed for Alexandria and Rome in 70 and left his command and the final siege of Jerusalem in the able hands of his son Titus. When Titus reached the outskirts of the city, he had 80,000 troops with him, and he would need them. Jerusalem, while not impregnable, was heavily fortified. On 3 sides, steep valleys provided natural fortifications, the most famous being the Valley of Kidron, very steep on the side near where the temple is, just between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. Troops could attack only from the north, where staunch walls and towers created 3 lines of defense. Titus mounted a classic military siege, and after 2 weeks, Josephus records, his troops became masters of the first wall. Five days later, they overtook the second wall, and the legionnaires rushed in. But the Jews, constantly growing in numbers and greatly at an advantage through their knowledge of the streets, wounded multitudes of the enemy as the Romans were fighting street by street. The defenders' victory was short-lived, however. Titus sealed off the town with a 5-mile earthen wall and killed anyone caught attempting to breach it with supplies. The tactic yielded quick results. The inhabitants were soon racked by starvation and disease. Starving Jews made desperate sorties to forage for food. Thousands of them were captured by the Romans and were crucified. Thousands of corpses festered throughout the city as people were dying in the city from starvation and were tossed over the walls to the valleys below. Well, tomorrow we'll look at the devastation that occurs as Jerusalem finally falls. I want you to read for tomorrow an article that you have in your packet. Read and highlight. Titus quells the revolt. And that'll give you information, some of which is related to what we talked about today. Some of it we'll be covering tomorrow. You see the article, Titus quells the revolt? Read and highlight that for tomorrow. Any questions about anything we said today? One more picture I should show you. This is in March 66, final days of the Jewish Commonwealth. And this is talking about the numerous signs that they saw leading up to this. Included in those recorded by Josephus, the historian who was there. He saw all this. He said that in the sky they saw armed hosts and chariots in the clouds. So the people of Jerusalem are seeing this up in the sky. They're seeing armies in the sky and chariots flying all over the land of Judea. A light at night makes the temple appear as though it were on fire. Halley's comet appeared. And you know, a comet has a tail. And the way that it was flying by, it looked like a sword pointing down at them. And Christians associated this period with the warnings of Jesus in Matthew 24. And a great number of the people fled the city. They headed east over the Jordan River to the safety of Pella, Jordan. We'll talk more about some of the signs that occurred tomorrow, too. Some of the things that were signs or omens of destruction. And the people in Jerusalem, many of them knew they were about to be destroyed by Rome. And we'll talk about that tomorrow.